We've spoken about modernism. Now it's time to talk about anti-modernism, because there is never a thrust in American society, culture, economics, or politics that doesn't generate resistance and a counter thrust. That's what we see here. Let's talk first about some of the tenets or trends of anti-modernism, having done basically the same thing with modernism. Among anti-moderns, those people who resisted or reacted, was a quest for certainty in the face of uncertainty. We see that in the rise, which we'll talk about in a following lecture, of religious fundamentalism, particularly among Protestants, and of anti-intellectualism. We see a rise of urban values versus rural values versus urban values. That is some of the same literature that we saw in earlier America, particularly in the Gilded Age, that resisted the rise of cities and the kind of society that the big anonymous city brought forward. We see a revival of that among worried ruralites who see their way of life being threatened by the creation of towns and cities that seems to be unstoppable. We also see a fearful nationalism that's kind of rabid, beginning with the violent suppression of dissent, because violent suppression of dissent is part of a quest for certainty, and the violent suppression of difference. This, remember, was going on before, during, and even after the rise of modern tendencies to mainstream certain kinds of previous others. And then we see also in this fearful nationalism, combined with racism, xenophobia, that is, a fear of foreigners. And this is not part of this anti-modernist thing isn't that we're seeing anything new. We're just seeing it more virulent and more widespread and much more vocal and organized than we've seen it before. We talked about nativism during the Gilded Age, and nativism stayed as a particularly virulent trend in American life. But even in the face of part of society accepting the presence of foreigners, or at least not resisting it, we see the success of xenophobic concepts, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, such as the National Origins Act, that successfully constricted immigration in the United States from the mid-1920s into the 1960s. One of the manifestations of this anti-modernist thread, trend in American life, was the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, there's no direct relationship between the Ku Klux Klan of the immediate post-Civil War era under Nathan Bedford Forrest and under other similar leaders in various places, and the second Ku Klux Klan that was revived at Stone Mountain, Georgia, on Thanksgiving Day, 1915, by a guy named William J. Simmons, who had made his livelihood creating or rather recruiting for brotherhood societies, fraternal organizations, primarily insurance, health and burial insurance societies, things like the Knights of Pythias and smaller organizations that provided not only fellowship, this was endemic in this era, but also provided health insurance. In many cases, these organizations would buy a bed in a hospital, for example, and if you paid into the organization, you could use that bed if you needed hospitalization. but also burial insurance. And that was particularly what we would call life insurance today. That was a particularly lucrative area to both sell insurance and to create fraternal organizations around. It's something that we don't talk about very much right now because it's really for graduate study, but it is interesting to note that Americans at that time would join organizations and help bury each other rather than commercializing it in insurance industries. The Klan was sparked by a couple of different things, at least according to the New Georgia Encyclopedia Online. One was the playing in 1915 of Birth of a Nation, a movie by Griffith that extolled white racism over and subjugation of pretty dastardly stereotypes of African Americans. And the Leo Frank case and lynching in particular of a Jewish mill owner's son who was accused of raping and murdering a 15-year-old girl, Mary Phelan. Leo Frank was subsequently convicted of this crime and lynched by an Atlanta mob in 1915. Well, these two things sparked Simmons and his cohorts to go to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and pledge themselves as an organization calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan. And it was Simmons that devised that uniform that we always associate with the Klan of the white robe and the pointed hat. Over the course of the next 15 years, the Klan had a great hand in not only Southern politics, but in national politics, and in fact was stronger outside of the South than it was in the South. And there are a great many reasons for that. Its main thrust was to combat moral decline, to emphasize Calvinist morality, to restore ethnic purity of that most moral of races in the U.S., the Anglo-Saxon. And let me caution you right now that this is not my opinion. I am parroting the opinion of these people at this time. They fervently believed that Anglo-Saxons were the apogee of human beings, and that they were threatened by mongrelization and miscegenation, not only from African Americans, but from inferior races like, for example, the Irish or Eastern Europeans, that inbreeding would destroy this. They had this great Calvinist morality, and this is part of what you might consider to be rural values versus urban values, where urbanism encouraged somewhat lax morality. The Klan enforced a much more strident morality. In fact, outside of certain enclaves in the South, the people that suffered at the hands of Klan vigilantism the most were white women who were engaged in sexual activity of some form or another. The Klan was able to access real political power in the 1920s. And they were, in fact, the representatives of a rural backlash of economically marginalized white Americans against what they saw as a general corruption of American life. They were taken over. Simmons couldn't make the thing grow as fast as he wanted it to, and so he contacted some public relations people in Indiana, who then took over the Klan and made it something of a pyramid scheme and really spread it far and wide, changing its central message in the process from one of being anti-black, which was common in the South, to being anti-Catholic for the most part. which played well in the North and the West. Eventually, there was a little too much violence for most people, and the corruption of the post-Simmons central leader of the Indiana Klan, a guy named David Stevenson, who you see pictured here, led to the demise of this second Klan. Now, some authors argue that the second Klan began to fall apart outside of the South, in large part because they had succeeded in gaining most of their program. Particularly after 1924, they had been able to secure a National Origins Act, that is, immigration restriction, which was the thing they were trying to sell the most. Now let's talk for just a second about David Stevenson and the shocking scandal that surrounded him. Stevenson kidnapped his secretary and raped her over the course of a few weeks, pretty constantly. But he was also, he eventually murdered her, not quickly, but by biting her so severely that she became infected. She was finally able to get away from him, and before she died of infection, remember this was the era before antibiotics were, particularly penicillin, was well known and well used. Penicillin wasn't introduced until 1941, but they could not stop this infection, and so she died after a couple of weeks of being incarcerated by him, molested by him, and then bitten savagely by him. And this was so shocking, not only to the general run of Americans, but also to the Klan itself, which would not countenance this kind of behavior, that it just kind of fell apart. The movement just kind of gave way. However, it was very strong, even a little bit after Simmons was convicted in 1927. And you see two images here, the Klan March in Washington, D.C. in 1925. In this case, it's the men, and then the women of the Klan marching in 1928. And the Klan sputtered on after Stevenson for a few years until it finally fell during the Depression in the 1930s. We normally associate the Klan with virulent racism, and that is in large part because of the so-called Third Klan, which arose in the 1950s, concomitant with and as a reaction to the civil rights movement. But not only was the Klan a harbinger of nativism as well as racism, but we see nativism as part and parcel of U.S. Domestic policy. Particularly, we see nativism as the underlying facet of the first Red Scare that occurred in 1919 and 1920. This Red Scare was a reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the communists taking over Russia in November of 1917. By 1919, A. Mitchell Palmer, the U.S. Attorney General you see pictured here, led raids. This is November 1919, and then again in January of 1920. Palmer and his ally, J. Edgar Hoover, who Palmer had appointed as the chief at 24 years old of the Bureau of Investigation, which throughout the 20th century would become known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover would be its czar, an absolute autocrat. He got his start under Mitchell Palmer, and Palmer led the November 1919 raids on radical labor right organizations looking particularly for anarchists. And J. Edgar Hoover led the January 1920 raids looking for anarchists as well. They and the public who became hysterical about this, and there had been, it wasn't like there was nothing to become hysterical about. There had been a large number of bombings In fact, one of the reasons that Palmer began his raids was the January 1920 raid was because his house was bombed by a dynamiter. So public hysteria, as well as political policy, led to mass arrests, but only a few deportations. In large part because the Department of Labor, which was responsible for enforcing some of the arrests and the deportation hearings, believed that Mitchell Palmer had lost his mind and had gone far too far in unleashing xenophobia in the U.S. There were about 10,000 radicals, particularly anarchists, arrested, and a little over 500 were actually convicted and deported, which included, think back to our older lectures, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike lecture of 1892. Not that the lecture was in 1892, but the strike was. And Alexander Berkman and his lady friend Emma Goldman, Red Emma, who was used as a boogeyman by parents who wanted to get their children to behave. They were arrested and deported. Alexander Berkman, you might remember, attempted to assassinate Henry Frick, who was the manager of the Homestead plant. Okay, another manifestation of nativism besides the Red Scare was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. These were two Italian anarchists who were arrested in 1920 for committing a bank robbery. They were accused of committing the bank robbery. They were arrested and tried on somewhat circumstantial evidence. They were tried. They were convicted principally on public hysteria. Their case lingered as they attempted to get stays of execution. One of the armed guards had been killed in this, and so the charge was murder. This occurred in Massachusetts. The Judge Thayer, made it known that he was already prejudiced against Sacco and Vanzetti. He said at one point that he would get those anarchists good and proper. This was prior to trial. And in an odd quirk of Massachusetts law, in order to get a rehearing and an appeal, the original trial judge had to agree that he made some errors, and Thayer never thought he made any errors. It took until 1927, the trial was fast, but it took until 1927 for the wheels of justice, so to speak, to grind, and Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927. Now, this had become a cause célèbre for workers and leftists worldwide. People around the globe protested and wanted the release of Sacco and Vanzetti. Later scholars believe that Vanzetti was innocent of this, but Sacco may have had a hand in this. He may actually have been one of the robbers. And in the photograph that you see here of the two fellows at the bottom, Vanzetti is the fellow to the left with the large walrus mustache. He was a fishmonger. That is, he sold fish from a cart in Boston. And Sacco, who was a shoemaker in a factory, you see to the right here. Now, nativism came to a head politically with immigration restriction acts that followed World War I. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, which restricted immigration to a quota of 3% of that nationality as found in the 1910 census. That means that if there were 100 Czechs discovered in the 1910 census, then every year free checks would be given visas to come into the United States. Well, by 1924, nativist agitation tightened those restrictions, and in the National Origins Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, those quotas were changed from 3% in the 1910 census to 2% in the 1890 census. Now, this was a pretty significant change, not because of the percentage, but because the census date changed. By 1910, we were 5 years into a significant increase in the number of Eastern Europeans and Middle Easterners that were immigrating to the U.S. But in 1890, the U.S. was still peopled primarily by Western Europeans. Western Europeans. So this system present in the National Origins Act of 1924 or the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 favored Northwest Europeans over Southern and Eastern Europeans. Now, the Johnson-Reed Act reestablished that the Chinese and Japanese were completely excluded. Well, this ends our lecture on anti-modernism. Our next lecture will be on religious fundamentalism, but we saw that anti-modernism arose at the same time as modernism. It was a quest for certainty. It extolled rural values over urban values, and it had as one of its tenets a fearful nationalism and fearful racism. At the same time, it's not intellectually or morally bankrupt, but we did look at some of the more disturbing manifestations of anti-modernism. Thank you very much. As promised, we want to take a look now at Protestant fundamentalism as an aspect of anti-modernism, particularly as an aspect of the quest for certainty in the anti-modernist area. Protestant fundamentalism began as a movement among evangelical Protestant denominations in the 1870s. And in the 1870s, we see the blossoming of a number of what we would even today call evangelical denominations. For example, the holiness tradition, which sprang from Methodism, began in the 1870s. The old Millerites developed into the Seventh-day Adventists a little earlier than the 1870s, but they became reasonably strong in the 1870s. And we see the development of other obviously Protestant denominations in the 1870s into the 1900s. But Protestant fundamentalism did not come to be as I hesitate to say as we understand it today, because we confuse that word fundamentalism with evangelical, and we use it as a political term in our modern political parlance. So let's back it up just a little bit. Fundamentalism was a particular brand, or not really a brand, but an area of Protestant belief that began in the 1870s and became articulated in the 19-teens. In 1912, it comes specifically from a set of 12 pamphlets that were financed by Lyman Stewart, pictured here, who was the president of Union Oil Company of California, which he paid for the publication of these 12 pamphlets. And together, these pamphlets go under the overall title of The Fundamentals. They codified the basic belief of what came to be known as fundamentalism. And the word fundamentalist was coined by and promoted by a Northern Baptist Conference Reverend Pastor Curtis Lee Laws at the 1920 Northern Baptist Conference in Boogaloo, New York. So what are some of the beliefs, some of the tenets of Protestant fundamentalism as articulated in these 12 pamphlets, the fundamentals? Really three three ideas found the fundamentals. The first and probably most critical is the literal interpretation of the Bible, biblical literalism, that the Bible is the inerrant, literal word of God. This was in direct opposition to the higher criticism of modernism that sprang from David Strauss and Ludwig Feuerbach. Another tenet of Protestant fundamentalism is the belief in the Genesis version of creation. Now, if you know much about the Bible, you know that there are 2 or 3 creation stories spread throughout the Old Testament. But the Protestant fundamentalists, as laid out in these pamphlets, chose the Genesis version of creation. That's the 6 days and the world is here version of creation. And there had to be one of the tenets was an absolute belief in both the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus, the physical resurrection of the body of Jesus as the Christ. These are the 3 great tenets of Protestant fundamentalism as laid out in these pamphlets. Another aspect of fundamentalism is that it was part and parcel of revivalism, at least revivalism, and there are waves of revivalism in American history, the so-called Great Awakening of the 1720s to 1740s, another Great Awakening in the 1820s to 1840s. There's some scholars that argue that there was a Great Awakening in 1857, at least a wave of revivalism, that's true, in 1857. There was another wave of revivalism during the Civil War in both North and South. Then there was this development of these new denominations from 1870 till about 1910, the articulation of fundamentalism. And then there was, after about 1912 into the 1930s, another wave of revivalism. And we see a lot of this in the 1920s, often associated with powerful preachers who tapped into public relations and public entertainment modes to help themselves. One of these is Foursquare's Amy Semple McPherson, who you see off on the left here, and another is Billy Sunday, who you see to the right. Both of these preachers, obviously very sincere, at the same time quite human, they're fascinating. They're fascinating studies. Starting with Billy Sunday, who's a little bit older than Amy Semple McPherson and whose career started a little bit earlier, became a millionaire through his revival preaching. He had started out as a baseball player, became a baseball star, left baseball to preach revivals, and became so powerful that when he came to a city, he could demand that the city erect a 5,000-seat auditorium for him. Often these were made of wood in a big square, because he only preached for a week or two at a place. He would take offerings from the people, and what he was selling was religion. He kind of commercialized religion. Amy Semple McPherson commercialized religion in Los Angeles. She really understood this new mass marketing technique of advertising, and she understood that she could play on emotion, and a sensitive emotion. She was also a faith healer. And Foursquare is now a recognized denomination, at least on the West Coast. I'm not sure how far it's spread, but up and down the West Coast, it's a reasonably powerful Protestant denomination. Foursquare began. Amy Semple McPherson was looking for a mechanism to promote her religious beliefs and to engage in revivalism. She built the Angelus Temple, the first permanent 5,000-seat auditorium in the United States. So giantism was part of her appeal. She was also, again, extremely emotional. She did some things that seemed kind of silly. For example, she created the Salvation Navy because the Salvation Army was already there, having been created in England and imported into the United States after 1870. McPherson had the eye of the nation, and at one point she disappeared for 14 days, and she reemerged from the Mexican desert, a little bit worse for wear, but telling a story of having been kidnapped. People thought that she had wandered off into the ocean and had drowned, but she told the story of being kidnapped and being held for ransom, but being able to escape. And this story just didn't really hold water. It became kind of obvious. This is a little slanderous, but it is pretty well accepted that she was having a love affair with her bookkeeper, and that they had run off. Didn't take any of the money, but that they had run off to Mexico for just a couple of week vacation and a tryst. But even though that had come out very early in her, almost immediately after she came back, it didn't damage her career at all. Eventually she faded from view, however, just like Billy Sunday did, hot on the heels, you might say, of the apogee that became the nadir of the Protestant fundamentalist movement. The thing that kind of killed it off was the so-called Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. Fundamentalists were able to pass a law that prohibited the teaching of Darwinian evolution in Tennessee. This is called the Butler Law. Immediately after it was passed, a science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, wanted to challenge the law. The American Civil Liberties Union, which existed then, wanted to challenge the law. And a group of local boosters wanted to bring tourists into Dayton, Tennessee. So all working together, really Scopes and the local boosters, and then bringing in the ACLU later, taught a class about evolution. That is, he taught one section of one class one day about evolution. He brought it up in his science class. He told the constabulary that he was going to do this, and they, after school, went and arrested him. Now, there's even some consternation about whether Scopes actually taught this class or not. He was, in one story, absent from school that day when the class was taught, and a substitute ended up teaching it. Nevertheless, he was arrested for this, and this wasn't any longer about, the trial was not about whether he had taught evolution or not. He pled not guilty, but it was well known that he was taking responsibility for this. This became a battle between the two guys that you see in the image on the right, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. The ACLU hired Clarence Darrow to defend John Scopes and to argue that the law itself was wrong and therefore should not be enforced. Not that Scopes did or didn't do it, was innocent or not, but that the law was faulty. William Jennings Bryan, in his last act, this trial led to his death. He joined the prosecution. The prosecution lost focus. And so the trial turned into what the boosters had wanted, which was a big show trial, bringing in a lot of passionate people from the countryside and from other places, spending all of their money in Dayton and putting Dayton on the map. The prosecution lost focus. Clarence Darrow was prevented from bringing in his expert witnesses to try to prove the validity of evolution, which was not at issue. The prosecution, however, allowed Darrow, and the judge allowed Darrow to question Bryan as an authority on the Bible. Once Bryan began testifying about the inerrancy of the Bible, then Clarence Darrow, and by the way, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan were friends and political and personal colleagues for years and years and years, but they differed on this one thing. This was billed as a battle between proper religion as extolled by William Jennings Bryan, the so-called Great Commoner, who you might remember from his Cross of Gold speech and from resigning as Secretary of State under Wilson because of Wilson's, what he thought of as Wilson's bellicose response to the Lusitania sinking. And Clarence Darrow, the agnostic's agnostic, the atheist's atheist, who's going to champion a stereotyped version of science. At least that's how this was billed. Bryan was skewered on the stand by Darrow, who tied Bryan up in knots. Not that Bryan was stupid, not that he did anything foolish, except allow himself to be questioned on inconsistencies in the Bible by Clarence Darrow. Eventually, the trial, which took place in the summer months, which in Dayton, Tennessee, extended apparently into October, but in the blistering summer of 1925, this trial took place. Eventually, John Scopes was found guilty, and the $100 fine he was required to pay was never paid by him. He went on, I'm not sure what happened to him. Clarence Darrow won the case, but the case killed William Jennings Bryan, who just after the case was over, had gone to speak on it, suffered a heart attack, and died before 1926. Anyway, we have looked at one significant element of anti-modernism, and that is religious fundamentalism, as it manifested itself between 1912 and 1930. And I thank you, as always, for your attention.
Let's talk now about a literary movement that is both part of the Southern Renaissance and part of the reaction to modernization and the industrial society that was growing in the United States. This is the Southern Agrarians. Southern Agrarians formed a small but loud intellectual movement that critiqued modern American society and culture. There have always been critics of society and culture, but the movements we remember in history are those that spring up in response to large changes. Industrialization and modernism, the intellectual movement that tried to accommodate industrialization, were such changes. Some critical movements are forward-looking. They say, for example, let's take these changes by the horns and try to steer them rather than being bystanders. Other critical movements are reactions, with some saying, whoa, let's slow this down, and others being even more extreme, let's go back to a past that we only imagine having existed. The Southern Agrarians reacted to industrialism and modernism, and a few of them went so far as to be considered reactionary, extremely right-wing. Regardless of their political leanings, the Southern Agrarians rejected the collectivization of society either by corporations or by the state, thinking that collectivization led to people being alienated from society, not having a place to fit in. On the left, Karl Marx had made a similar critique of the way industrial capitalism was developing. He called the psychological problem of alienation by the term ennui. Where Marx had critiqued industrial capitalism at its beginnings and from the left, the Southern Agrarians critiqued the maturing industrial capitalism and state collectivization from the right, positing a society that privileged the individualism of yeoman farmers and small entrepreneurs. They express this idea under the phrase agrarianism versus industrialism. The Southern agrarians were specific to the South. They are associated with Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and they began to meet about 1915 and became intensely collaborative. Many of their friendships lasted more than 50 years. Historian Paul Conklin compares the agrarians to another critical movement, the Transcendentalists of the 19th century, who centered on Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. One of the most important contributions of the agrarians, whether people agreed with them or not, was that they formed a movement that forced Southerners to think about their identity in the midst of serious change in American society. Who were the agrarians? To begin with, they were members of the emerging Southern intellectual elite, men who, even though they individually had to struggle to attain station, and very few attained the highest stations, were of the narrow group who had access to station. The agrarians were led by what they informally called the Big Three: Donald Davidson, a professor of English at Vandy; John Ransom, a professor of English and an avocational economist. This was an era when the disciplines were not exclusive; and Alan Tate, a writer and sometime professor of English. There grew to be an inner circle of up to a dozen who worked with the Big Three, and another dozen in an outer circle. The agrarians emerged in about 1925 from the so-called fugitive poets circle that had coalesced around the small journal entitled The Fugitive at Vanderbilt. They were like-minded in their critique of corporatization of business and collectivism in government, but they reached their full flower in 1925 and produced their major work in 1930. That work was the essays in the volume I'll Take My Stand. What catalyzed the agrarians was the sometimes vehement argument over the teachings of evolution in schools, including at Vanderbilt. This argument and the Scopes trial led the Big Three to compose a manifesto that opens the book and to solicit essays from agrarians who agreed with the manifesto. Some did, others did not. The manifesto and book posited that the collective culture that attended industrialization turned people into mere ciphers, numbers and resources to be exploited and calculated. People became inputs and consumers, and society became overrun with short-term calculation of profit above all other values. I'll Take My Stand is deliberately overwritten and hyperbolic, both in order to make various points about politics and society, as well as being in the tradition of Southern humor writing. This led it to be misunderstood more by Southerners than by Northerners, indicating that Southerners were ripe for considering their identity in the face of changes wrought by industrialization and mass society. A wide variety and large number of reviewers, over 100, reviewed the book. Most had problems with it, and from that point on, Donald Davidson was bitter about the book's reception. The first years of the Great Depression suppressed activities of the Southern agrarians after I'll Take My Stand was published, but the election of Franklin Roosevelt and the coming New Deal led the agrarians to try to turn their critique into a movement. The movement set its sights on Roosevelt's programs to rescue and restore small farms and provide resources so small farmers could be landowners. They supported the Farm Security Administration's rural rehabilitation and resettlement programs, as well as land and agricultural reform that favored small over large farms. By 1937, the federal government decided to follow policies that favored crop manipulation that only corporate farms could implement, and began reducing its funding of small farm programs. Additionally, the agrarians, who were white supremacists, that is most of them, detected a decided shift in Roosevelt's policies that benefited black farmers and workers, so the movement collapsed. The legacy of the agrarians as individuals is much more important than their legacy as a group. Some of them went on to become important in their fields, such as Alan Tate and John Ransom in literary criticism, Robert Penn Warren in literature, and Frank Owsley and H.C. Nixon in history. But the Southern agrarians did mark a point in the intellectual life of the South that drew national attention for a number of years. They were part of the Southern Renaissance in literature. They also articulated the critique of the powerful white middle class in the South about how society should function in the world created by industrial capitalism. That response was, for the most part, reactionary and was rushed under the onrush of events. That response was, for the most part, reactionary and was subsumed under the onrush of events. This then ends the lecture. And as always, thanks for your attention.